Doc, it's great to have you on the program. Thank you so much indeed for making time to speak to us. I suppose this is the point where you tell us that Ayanda is the most unique name in the world, and in fact, you've never come across anybody with that kind of name. But I suggest, I suppose the truth is somewhere far from that. Let's begin by first taking stock of the number of births, if we can. 500, at least in 2022. How should we look at that? How does it compare to other years?
From what we know, it's fair to say, we would probably know the 2021 stock of babies who were born in South Africa. And from that stock in 2021, over 1 million were registered at Home Affairs. I think, Ayanda, maybe I need to start by clarifying that in State SA, we deal mostly with registrations, which means the births that occurred in a particular year and were registered with the Department of Home Affairs.
Oh, all right.
So, so I will talk to you mostly about the 2021 births. In 2021, we had just over 1 million registered. Of those, 950 almost were those that occurred in 2021 and were registered in 2021.
Right.
Then the difference was late registrations. I think one thing that we're still grappling with in this country is the births that are registered late. Otherwise, we would have the births as they occur in health facilities.
Sure. And help us understand why that's important, Dr. Nhlapo. I mean, if the birth is eventually registered, some people might be asking, what's the fuss about it being late?
In terms of the law, in terms of the Birth and Death Registration Act, a birth in South Africa must be registered within 30 days of occurrence. And that is to ensure that we take stock of everybody. As you know, in terms of international law, recognition of a birth is critical for anybody to be recognized as having been born. In Africa, and South Africa is quite different. In Africa, most babies are born and they die without having been recognized by their government or as having ever lived. South Africa is quite unique in that most of our births are actually registered. By the end of the year, over 95% of the births in South Africa are registered. Unfortunately, we're still struggling to get them to register in terms of the legal requirements, which is 30 days. And we saw that during COVID, we regressed a bit. Prior to COVID, above 86% of births were registered within the required 30 days, 30 days of birth. In 2020, we went down to 70%, and in 2021, it was 75%. So we are recovering slowly, but there was a bit of a regress, and I think it's understandable. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. All right, let's speak about the most common names then, and I wonder whether the list is different for boys and girls in this country in a context where, again, an Ayanda, until you meet them, may very well be a male or female.
Yes. And I have to say, and this is very common only in South Africa, where you have names that are shared across the sexes. But for 2021, the most common names, the three top names for boys were Lethabo, Lubanzi, and Melokuhle. And for girls, it was Melokuhle, Umphile, and Uminati. And when you look at this, the names that were common for both sexes were Melokuhle, Lethabo, and Letukuhle. And one thing interesting about names is that it's generational. Right. Ayanda belonged to a previous generation where it will be a common name in that generation. And as we move to the next generation, you can see Abomelokuhle, Letukuhle are more common, Umphile, Lethabo. And we've seen that, I think, for the last couple of years, these names kept appearing in the top 10. Names.
That is incredibly interesting. You know, in theater, people speak about plays that are written in a certain time being a reflection of the society in that moment. I wonder to what extent we could say the same about names, right? Especially as you mentioned, because they are so generation specific.
Yes, I think every generation have popular names.
Right.
And then you see as time goes by, these will actually go out and new names will come in. in my children's generation, it was your Ayanda, your Katleho, Teboho, and those have moved on now. It's new names.
Oh, thank goodness. I don't mind that. I've met enough Ayandas in my lifetime. But, that being said, every parent, I suppose, would give somebody a name thinking it's unique. Did you find that's how it works? That everybody, for instance, reckons to themselves, nobody's ever going to name their child Lethabo, because my Lethabo is a special one, so to speak.
Not really. Not really. I think it's just popular names. I suppose, like I say, it's generational.
Yeah.
Maybe your cousin has a child, they name them Lethabo, then you see, I like that name. And when you ultimately have a child, you name the child Lethabo. Or you might have heard it somewhere.
Oh, what a pity. It looks like we've lost our audio to Dr. Nhlapo. I'm going to try and hold on to this chat as much as we can because of just how interesting it is. Dr. Nhlapo, I'm hoping you're able to hear me now. We did lose you a short while ago as you were still explaining to us that, people actually don't mind that their children's names are quite common. In fact, in many instances, they gravitate towards them because they've heard it before.
Yes, definitely. I think it's more if you've heard a name somewhere, when you do have a child, you then likely to say, I like this one because it's a more common name in that era. That's Lethabo, Mpile, Melokuhle, Letokuhle. And that generation, when it passes, new names comes in because then new popular names start coming up.
Fascinating. I wonder what the sociologists have to say about this, but we'll leave those questions to them to unpack. Are you finding through the stats, Dr. Nhlapo, that some of these names are actually very cultural specific? In other words, you find that the more common names appear in specific cultural groups than across the board, so to speak?
Yes. When you look at it, for instance, Melokuhle, it's common in Mpumalanga, Eastern Cape, and in KZN. So you see certain names because of the culture in that province. If you go to Gauteng, you see Lethabo. So it depends on the province. What is the most dominant culture, and it sort of comes through. Even with Senin, you see that you start seeing certain because of that culture is dominant in that province. You go to the Western Cape, you start seeing more either English or Afrikaans name being in the top 10 more than the other groups because of the dominance of certain cultural groups.
Yeah. I wonder to what extent South Africans inherit the popular names beyond our borders. For the longest time, at least last time I checked, Mohammed, for instance, was apparently the most common name in the world. One wonders, I've met Mohammeds, of course, in this country, but one wonders to what extent, as a country, we respond to that.
I think in our country, I have to apologize. I lost you a bit there, but I hope I got the gist of your question. I think in South Africa, like I said, you have to stretch that number for you to get all the other cultural groups. For instance, I heard you talk about Mohammed. Probably if we can stretch this group to maybe the top 50 or the top 100, then you start seeing other cultures creeping. But the mere dominance of Black Africans in South Africa in terms of numbers, then it means that our names will more likely be in the top 10 than any other group.
Yeah.
I hope I have answered the question.
Yes, well, yeah, in certain respects. I was asking to what extent we respond to the common names beyond our borders, because, and Mohammed is an example I used. I know that to be the most common name in the world, not just, in specific areas.
Okay. Yeah, I think no. In South Africa, we are, like I indicated when I started, in South Africa we are quite unique. For instance, in the rest of the continent, you won't find names that are common across sexes. And in other African countries, names mostly relate to a region a person originates from. South Africa has sort of evolved. We want names that reflects good, that reflects positiveness, and you see that coming through in our names. But we don't necessarily go beyond our borders. Maybe, like I said, if I start looking maybe at other cultures, maybe you're Muslims within South Africa, or other Africans who have migrated to South Africa, then you start seeing those. But then it means we have to look at the whole list of names, which is on the top 10 that we normally will start looking at when we start looking at the data.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Speaking about the data, I know you look at births and deaths at Stats SA, and I wonder what kind of relationship those two rates have, if any at all. In many instances, for instance, we're worried about the rate at which people are being born versus the rate at which we can grow the country's economy. But of course, you don't worry about the economics necessarily, I imagine. But what kind of, I guess, details are you looking into when you look at the country's mortality rates and the birth rate?
Okay, I think I have to start talking to you about some of the challenges we have in terms of the births and related deaths and for babies. And it's part of the reason why the Department of Health will move on and say you have to register that birth within 30 days, because then children die sometimes without being registered. Then we don't know if is it a death or the child is still going to come because the birth is late. But in terms of the deaths from the births, the deaths to children has been declining over time. And it's more a function of health interventions and how we've tried to intervene. You remember at some point, South Africa had an issue with the HIV deaths, and it was more mothers and babies who are likely to be victims of that. And with the interventions we have had, and that has slowed down a bit, and we see that in the data. But most of the children that die, if that birth we didn't catch it, as they say, then we won't publish it in the deaths, and which is where the Home Affairs starts intervening for us, for that we catch the children as early as possible and register them, so that then we can track that this child came in and they registered and then they died at this stage. That is still a bit of a challenge for us until people start understanding that you have to register your birth as soon as the child is born, so that we can then have better statistics for deaths, for babies in this case,
That's so fascinating. I think many people don't make that kind of connection between births and deaths. Dr. Nhlapo, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. I found this to be a very eye-opening conversation, at least for myself. I really appreciate your time. Dr. Mosidi Nhlapo is the Director of Births and Deaths at Statistics South Africa.